All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about the expansion of World War I outside of Europe. So we're going to take a look at areas that are not in Europe, but because of the European conflict get dragged into the war. And so there are three big reasons why the war expands outside of Europe. And we'll explore a few of these as we go through this video. First is that because the Europeans had a bunch of colonies all over the world, the colonies get dragged into the war too. So the colonies get dragged into the war, and this sees fighting in Africa, in China, to a smaller extent in South Asia. But because the European powers have colonies all over the world, the war extends to Africa, China, and South Asia. Related to that point, the European powers needed soldiers. And so they use their colonies to supply soldiers to Europe. So it would not be odd to find in the trenches of the European theater soldiers from Africa, soldiers from India. But on top of that, the British Commonwealth provided lots of soldiers too. So we see a lot of Canadian soldiers and Australian and New Zealanders. And we'll talk about the Australians and the New Zealanders in a second. The third reason is that other imperial powers outside of Europe use the conflict for their own goals. And principally, here we're going to bring in Japan and the United States. So this kind of encompasses just about every place in the world, aside from South America, although South America does get involved economically. Which is great for them during the war, but is going to actually be one of the causes of the Great Depression, but we'll worry about that when we get to the Great Depression. All right, so let's tackle all of these areas in turn. So let's talk about Japan for a second. All right, so basically, Japan gets into the war because Germany does not immediately surrender its sphere of influence in China to Japan. And when Germany doesn't do that, Japan declares war. And this happens almost at the very beginning of the war. This happens in 1914. Now, Japan does this in order to extend its own influence over China. And to do this, it issues what become known as the 21 demands. Now, the 21 demands are grouped into 5 groups. Five sections. The first 4 of these sections pretty much just kind of expand a little bit on what Japan was already doing in China. The 5th section essentially gave Japan control over China's economy and security, meaning its military. Now, the first 4 sections of this everybody was cool with because pretty much everybody involved in the war had a sphere of influence in China. But this last bit made everybody do a double take. And Great Britain, and later the United States, forced Japan to leave out that 5th section of demands. And in doing so, made the UK and the United States kind of suspicious of Japan's intentions in China. And not to go too far away from World War I, this is going to cause the Japanese to align with Germany after World War I. But we'll worry about that when we get closer to World War II. So next place we'll look at is Africa. Now, Africa's biggest contribution into World War I was providing soldiers to the European campaign. So there was a lot of African soldiers. There were many African soldiers who fought in Europe. And a lot of these African soldiers fought in Europe with the hope that doing so would lead to their independence. That won't happen for like another 30, 35, 40 years, but that was why they fought. There were some campaigns in Africa. The Europeans fought over the German colonies in Africa. And the Allies ended up taking all of them. But it took more or less the whole war to do so, and Germany was going to lose all of their colonial possessions anyway in the Treaty of Versailles. Another place we should take a quick look at is in the Ottoman Empire. Now, we've already brought the Ottoman Empire into the story because they were one of the reasons that the war started in the first place. But there is another important chapter of the war that involves the Ottoman Empire, and this is the Gallipoli Campaign. This happens in 1915. So the point of the Gallipoli Campaign, this was a British effort to open up a new front in the war. So we've talked about the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The Gallipoli Campaign was designed to open up a Southern Front. Attacking what was seen as the weak link in the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. So the goal here was to knock out the Ottomans and open up a warm water supply route to Russia. So I'm going to pull the map over here so you can see where we're talking about. So the Gallipoli Campaign was right in here. So the goal was to control some of this territory to get access to the Black Sea and supply Russia from the south. That was the idea. Most of the soldiers were Australian and New Zealanders. Unfortunately, this was a complete failure for the British. Thousands of soldiers were killed, and they didn't do any of their goals. And this actually serves as a kind of rallying cry for Australian and New Zealand's independence. There was another interesting little campaign that happened in the Ottoman Empire, and this was the work of a man named T.E. Lawrence, who was a British spy slash diplomat who successfully convinced the Arabs to rebel against their Ottoman rulers. And there's a really famous movie about this guy's life called Lawrence of Arabia. So this happens in 1916. All right, so the last place we're going to take a quick look at is the United States. Now, the United States, when the war started, was technically neutral. But they wanted to continue trading with Europe. And if this sounds familiar, this is more or less the same situation the United States found itself during the Napoleonic Wars. Which led to the War of 1812. So if this sounds familiar, it should, because basically the same thing was happening about 100 years before this. So the Germans used their submarines, also called U-boats. In German, a submarine is an Unterseeboot, so U-boats. The Germans used their submarines to attack ships they thought were supplying the Allies. And in 1915, they blew up a cruise ship called the Lusitania. Now, it was a British ship, but a lot of Americans died when the ship sank. And so the U.S. pressured Germany to stop their unrestricted submarine warfare. And they did. So Germany agreed until 1917. In 1917, it became pretty clear to the Germans that they were going to lose the war unless they started blowing up the British Navy and any ships coming to supply Great Britain. So they started back up. In 1917, hoping to starve the British out before the Americans entered the war. Not a bad strategy, but the British held out long enough for the Americans to join the war and basically end it. So the Americans declared war on April 6th, 1917, and about 18 months later, the war ends. On November the 11th, 1918. So about 18 months later, the war ends because the Americans send hundreds of thousands of fresh troops and tanks and weapons, and it just tips the balance of the war, which had been a stalemate, into the Allies' favor. So we'll stop there, and in our next video, we will look at some of the events that took place during the war that aren't necessarily tied to the war itself. So we'll look at a few other events. So we'll look at the unfortunate Armenian genocide. We'll look at the Easter Rising in Ireland, an attempt at Irish independence. And we'll look at some French army mutinies that took place right after the Americans joined the war in April of 1917. So that'll be our next video. We'll look at those three incidents that happened during the war. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.